This comprehensive analysis examines the peculiar behavioral patterns of the human species, specifically their consistent positioning at the rear of galactic assemblies, spacecraft configurations, and strategic formations. What initially appeared to be a sign of weakness or submission has been revealed through extensive observation to be one of the most sophisticated survival mechanisms ever documented in galactic history. The human philosophy of destroying one's weak self has proven to be not merely psychological conditioning, but a fundamental restructuring of species-wide behavioral patterns that renders them virtually indestructible through conventional means. The findings contained within this document have been deemed so significant that they have altered our understanding of what constitutes true strength in an interstellar civilization context. The implications extend far beyond simple military considerations and touch upon the very nature of survival, adaptation, and the evolution of consciousness itself. Part 1. The Observation Period. The first recorded instance of human backseating behavior occurred during the inaugural Galactic Council session following Earth's admission to the interstellar community. Ambassador Sarah Chen, representing the human delegation, chose a seat in the final row of the vast amphitheater, despite being offered positions of honor at the front alongside other founding species representatives. This decision puzzled the assembled delegates, who interpreted it through their own cultural lenses as either profound humility or concerning weakness. The Zarathian representative, whose species had dominated through aggressive posturing for millennia, whispered to his aide that humans would clearly pose no threat to established power structures. The crystalline Vectar observers noted the positioning in their emotion matrix recordings as strategically disadvantageous, while the highly militaristic Kethmori marked it as tactically unsound. None of these species, despite their advanced civilizations and sophisticated understanding of warfare, commerce, and diplomacy, recognized what they were actually witnessing. Over the following standard galactic years, this pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency. Human representatives, traders, explorers, and even military attachés invariably gravitated toward rear positions in every conceivable scenario. In diplomatic conferences, they occupied back tables. In joint exploration missions, they requested rearguard positions. During ceremonial gatherings, they stood at the periphery. In multi-species educational exchanges, human students selected seats in the back rows. The behavior seemed so counterintuitive to species that had evolved to compete for dominant positions that extensive studies were commissioned to understand this apparent anomaly. The initial hypothesis suggested that humans possessed an ingrained submissive tendency, perhaps an evolutionary remnant from their predator-heavy homeworld. This theory gained traction when xenobiologists noted that many Earth prey species exhibited similar behavior patterns, seeking safety in peripheral positions where they could monitor threats and maintain escape routes. However, this explanation failed to account for the paradoxical nature of human achievement despite their positioning choices. While sitting in the back, human representatives consistently outperformed their front-row counterparts in negotiations, demonstrating an uncanny ability to read room dynamics, identify pressure points, and craft solutions that other species had overlooked. Their rear-positioned trading delegations secured deals that front-and-center competitors couldn't match. Their military advisors, operating from support positions, developed strategies that rendered traditional dominance displays obsolete. The turning point in understanding came during the Sigma Draconis crisis, when a previously unknown hostile force emerged from the galactic core and began systematically dismantling the territorial holdings of every major species. The attack pattern was devastatingly effective because it targeted leadership structures first, eliminating the prominently positioned command hierarchies that most civilizations relied upon for coordination and control. The Zarathians, with their hierarchical command structures prominently displayed at the front of every formation, found their leadership decimated in the opening hours of each engagement. The Vectar's crystal network nodes, positioned for maximum visibility and coordination efficiency, became obvious targets that the enemy exploited with surgical precision. The Kethmori's proud warrior traditions, which demanded that leaders fight at the forefront of every battle, resulted in the systematic elimination of their most experienced commanders. In contrast, human forces presented no obvious targets. Their command structures, naturally distributed toward rear positions, remained intact while more traditional forces collapsed. What the galaxy had interpreted as weakness revealed itself as an evolutionary adaptation so profound that it rendered conventional attack strategies obsolete. The humans weren't hiding in the back out of fear. They were positioned there by design, having unconsciously developed a species-wide behavioral modification that prioritized survival over appearance. But even this revelation only scratched the surface of what researchers would eventually discover about the human approach to strength and vulnerability. The true depth of their adaptive strategy would only become apparent as the crisis deepened and other species began to study human survivors with increased urgency and respect. The documentation from this period reveals a consistent pattern of misunderstanding followed by grudging acknowledgement. Species after species discovered that their initial assessments of human positioning had been catastrophically wrong. The beings they had dismissed as weak or overly cautious were systematically outlasting, outmaneuvering, and outperforming civilizations that had dominated their respective regions of space for millennia. Dr. Zekthara, the leading xenopsychologist of the Andromedian Institute, noted in her preliminary findings, "We have been observing human behavior through the lens of our own evolutionary imperatives. We assumed that optimal positioning meant maximum visibility and immediate access to resources. The humans have demonstrated that true optimal positioning prioritizes survival, adaptability, and the maintenance of strategic flexibility over symbolic displays of dominance." This observation would prove prophetic as the galaxy's understanding of human behavior continued to evolve. The species that sat in the back weren't avoiding responsibility or hiding from challenges. They were positioning themselves to be the last ones standing when every other approach had failed. The implications of this realization would reshape galactic politics, military doctrine, and even philosophical understanding of what constituted genuine strength. As the initial observation period concluded, xenosociologists began developing new frameworks for understanding human behavior. Traditional models of dominance and submission proved inadequate for a species that had somehow evolved beyond the conventional competition for prominent positioning. The humans had discovered something that no other known species had achieved: a way to be simultaneously present and protected, engaged yet insulated, participating fully while maintaining the capacity to survive when participation became dangerous. The most unsettling aspect of these early observations was the unconscious nature of human behavior. Unlike other species that made calculated decisions about positioning based on immediate tactical considerations, humans seemed to gravitate toward rear positions through instinct. This suggested that their survival adaptations had been encoded at a level deeper than conscious strategy. They had been integrated into the species' fundamental behavioral programming through evolutionary pressures that no other galactic civilization had experienced. Part 2. The philosophy of self-destruction and reconstruction. The second phase of human behavioral analysis began when researchers gained access to human historical records and philosophical texts. What they discovered fundamentally altered their understanding, not just of human positioning preferences, but of the entire human approach to existence itself. The species that sat in the back had developed a philosophical framework so radical that it challenged the basic assumptions about consciousness, identity, and survival that underpinned every known galactic civilization. The core concept, expressed in various forms throughout human history, centered on the deliberate destruction of perceived weakness within oneself as a pathway to true invulnerability. Unlike other species that sought to strengthen their existing traits or eliminate external threats, humans had developed methodologies for systematically identifying and eliminating their own limitations from within. This process, documented across cultures and time periods, represented a form of controlled psychological evolution that no other species had achieved. Ancient human texts spoke of killing the ego, burning away the false self, and dying to be reborn. Initially, galactic researchers dismissed these as primitive mystical concepts with no practical applications. However, deeper analysis revealed that these weren't merely philosophical abstractions. They were operational instructions for a form of consciousness restructuring that produced measurably superior survival outcomes under extreme conditions. The human practice of voluntary exposure to discomfort, challenge, and even danger served a purpose that extended far beyond simple conditioning. Where other species sought to minimize risk and maximize comfort, humans deliberately sought out situations that would reveal their limitations, force adaptation, and ultimately eliminate weaknesses through directed experience. This wasn't masochism or reckless behavior. It was a systematic approach to evolutionary acceleration at the individual level. Dr. Nelkathar of the Regalian Academy of Consciousness Studies noted, "Human psychological development follows patterns that would be considered pathological in any other species. They actively seek out experiences that cause distress, deliberately place themselves in situations where failure is possible, and appear to derive satisfaction from overcoming obstacles that they could have easily avoided. This behavior makes no sense from a traditional risk assessment perspective until you observe the long-term results. Those long-term results were extraordinary. Humans who had undergone this process of voluntary self-challenge demonstrated resilience levels that exceeded anything previously documented. They retained functionality under stress conditions that would incapacitate other species. They recovered from psychological trauma faster and more completely than any known biological or synthetic consciousness. Most significantly, they appeared to become stronger rather than weaker when exposed to adversity. The mechanism behind this phenomenon puzzled researchers until they began studying human neuroplasticity and psychological adaptation mechanisms. The human brain, when subjected to controlled stress, didn't simply endure the experience, it restructured itself to handle similar challenges more effectively in the future. This created a positive feedback loop where each successfully navigated difficulty increased the individual's capacity to handle greater difficulties. But the truly revolutionary aspect of human psychology wasn't individual adaptation. It was their approach to identity itself. While other species developed strong, stable sense of self that they then defended against external threats, humans had learned to maintain a fluid, adaptable identity that could be consciously modified as circumstances required. They could literally kill aspects of themselves that proved maladaptive and birth new aspects that served their survival better. This process manifested in countless ways throughout human culture. Their educational systems emphasized learning from failure rather than avoiding it. Their entertainment celebrated characters who overcame adversity through self-transformation rather than external conquest. Their philosophical traditions provided frameworks for understanding identity as something to be constantly refined rather than permanently established. The implications for their repositioning behavior became clear as researchers studied these patterns. Humans didn't sit in the back because they were weak. They positioned themselves there because they had already destroyed whatever weakness within themselves might have demanded front-row validation. They had eliminated the psychological need for prominent positioning through internal transformation, freeing themselves to choose positions based purely on strategic advantage rather than ego requirements. Commander Vextar of the Combined Fleet Strategic Analysis Division observed, "We have been fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of human positioning choices. We assumed they were accepting inferior positions due to low status or confidence. In reality, they had transcended the entire status hierarchy by eliminating their internal dependence on external validation. They sit wherever provides the best strategic advantage because they have no emotional investment in appearing dominant." This revelation led to extensive studies of human military history, where the pattern became even more apparent. Human military leaders frequently operated from positions that provided tactical advantage rather than symbolic authority. They developed command structures that could function without centralized leadership, created redundant systems that remained operational even when primary elements were eliminated, and trained soldiers to be capable of independent operation rather than dependent on hierarchical direction. The concept of leading from behind appeared throughout human military philosophy, representing not cowardice but sophisticated understanding of how to maintain organizational effectiveness under extreme conditions. Human commanders positioned themselves where they could best observe, analyze, and respond to changing situations, rather than where they would be most visible to either their own forces or their enemies. This approach extended to their individual warrior training as well. While other species focused on building strength, humans focused on eliminating weakness. Their combat training emphasized identifying personal limitations and systematically addressing them rather than simply amplifying existing capabilities. They developed mental conditioning techniques that allowed warriors to function effectively, even when separated from support structures, stripped of equipment, or placed in completely unfamiliar situations. The philosophical underpinnings of this approach traced back to fundamental human insights about the nature of consciousness and identity. They had discovered that most suffering and limitation came not from external circumstances but from internal attachments to specific outcomes, identities, or situations. By learning to consciously release these attachments, they could maintain psychological equilibrium and operational effectiveness regardless of external conditions. This wasn't emotional numbing or psychological withdrawal. It was conscious flexibility that allowed them to engage fully with any situation while maintaining the capacity to adapt when circumstances changed. They could commit completely to a course of action while simultaneously remaining prepared to abandon it if a better option emerged. They could identify strongly with a role or position while retaining the ability to assume a different role if necessary. The most profound aspect of this philosophy was its approach to failure and defeat. While other species viewed failure as something to be avoided or overcome, humans had learned to extract value from every failure experience. They developed systematic methods for analyzing unsuccessful outcomes, identifying contributing factors, and integrating lessons learned into improved future performance. This created a spiral of continuous improvement that accelerated under pressure rather than degrading. The more challenges they faced, the more rapidly they evolved their capabilities. The more failures they experienced, the more robust their eventual success strategies became. They had discovered how to transform every setback into a setup for greater future achievement. Dr. Zarathek, leading the Multi-Species Psychology Research Consortium, concluded, "Humans have achieved something that we previously thought impossible. They have learned to consciously direct their own evolutionary development. Rather than being shaped by environmental pressures, they actively seek out challenges that will force them to develop desired capabilities. They have become partners with evolution rather than subjects of it." This partnership with evolutionary pressure explained their positioning preferences on a deeper level. By consistently choosing positions that required them to work harder, see more clearly, and think more strategically, they ensured their continued development even in relatively comfortable or stable situations. They had made challenge and growth not something that happened to them, but something they actively pursued as a fundamental life strategy. Part 3. The ultimate test in galactic recognition. The third phase of human behavioral analysis occurred during what became known as the Great Convergence Crisis, when the mysterious hostile forces from the galactic core revealed themselves to be something far more dangerous than anyone had initially understood. The enemy wasn't simply another aggressive species seeking territorial expansion. It was a collective consciousness that assimilated other civilizations by incorporating their strongest members and destroying the rest. The assimilation process proved devastatingly effective against traditional galactic civilizations because it targeted exactly those traits that other species had spent millennia developing. Leaders who had cultivated commanding presence found themselves unable to resist the entity's influence. Warriors who had built their identity around dominance became willing servants once that dominance was redirected. Civilizations that had organized themselves around clear hierarchies discovered that their most capable members could be turned against them by corrupting the chain of command. The entity's strategy was elegantly simple. Identify each species' concept of strength and excellence, then demonstrate superior versions of those same qualities to compel submission. Species that valued physical prowess were overwhelmed by displays of superior force. Those that prized intellectual achievement were humbled by demonstrations of greater knowledge. Civilizations built on technological advancement found themselves facing incomprehensibly advanced systems that rendered their own capabilities obsolete. In every case, the assimilation followed the same pattern. The entity would arrive, demonstrate superiority in whatever domains the target civilization valued most highly, and then offer the choice between service and destruction. Most species faced with undeniable evidence of their inferiority chose service. Those that refused were systematically dismantled by converted members of their own civilization who now served the greater collective. The approach failed catastrophically when applied to humans. The entity's first attempt at human assimilation followed its established protocol. It identified human civilization's apparent strengths, technological adaptation, social cooperation, individual resilience, and prepared demonstrations of superior capability in each area. The results were exactly what had worked against hundreds of other species. Human technology was revealed to be primitive compared to collective capabilities. Human social structures were shown to be inefficient relative to total coordination. Individual human achievement paled beside the accumulated accomplishments of assimilated civilizations. What the entity couldn't understand was why these demonstrations had no effect on human behavior. Other species, when confronted with evidence of their limitations, experienced psychological collapse that made them receptive to assimilation. Humans, when shown their weaknesses, began systematically working to address them. The entity escalated its approach, targeting human individuals who appeared to represent their species' highest achievements. It corrupted human leaders, turned human heroes, and demonstrated that even the best of humanity could be made to serve the collective will. This strategy had broken the morale of countless species as they watched their greatest champions become enemy agents. Humans responded by developing new leaders to replace the corrupted ones. They created new heroes to replace those that had fallen. They established systems that could function without depending on any specific individuals, no matter how capable or inspiring. The entity had expected to break human resistance by removing their strongest members. Instead, it discovered that removing strong humans simply caused other humans to become stronger. The breakthrough in understanding came when xenopsychologist Dr. Veltara analyzed the fundamental difference between human and non-human responses to superiority demonstrations. Every other species evaluated the entity's capabilities against their own and concluded that resistance was futile. Humans evaluated the entity's capabilities against what they might become and concluded that resistance was necessary for development. The entity makes the same mistake we initially made, Dr. Veltara noted in her analysis. It assumes that demonstrating superior capability will discourage opposition. For humans, demonstrating superior capability simply clarifies the next development target. They don't ask, how can we compete with this? They ask, what do we need to become to surpass this? This fundamental difference in psychological orientation made humans immune to the entity's primary assimilation mechanism. Where other species saw insurmountable obstacles, humans saw development opportunities. Where others experienced despair at evidence of their limitations, humans experienced excitement at discovering new areas for growth. The entity's second approach involved direct psychological assault, attempting to break human resistance by forcing individuals to confront their deepest fears, insecurities, and limitations. This method had proven effective against species that maintained strong, rigid identities that could be shattered through targeted trauma. The entity would identify each individual's core sense of self and then systematically demolish it through personalized psychological torture. Again, the approach failed when applied to humans. The entity discovered that humans had already performed this process on themselves voluntarily. They had already identified their fears, confronted their limitations, and deliberately dismantled whatever aspects of their identity proved maladaptive. The psychological tools that broke other species were tools that humans had been using on themselves for millennia. Commander Sarah Reeves, captured during the early phases of the entity's assault, provided crucial intelligence about the failed assimilation attempts after her eventual escape. They kept trying to show me things that would break me, my failures, my weaknesses, my worst moments. But I'd already examined all of that. I'd already decided which parts of myself I needed to change and which parts I could accept. They were trying to destroy a version of myself that I'd already outgrown. The entity's third approach involved attempting to corrupt human philosophy itself, arguing that their pursuit of self-improvement was ultimately futile because perfection was impossible and suffering was inevitable. This argument had proven effective against species that pursued development as a means to an end. Once convinced that the end was unattainable, they abandoned the means as well. Humans responded with genuine curiosity about the entity's perspective. They engaged in philosophical discussions about the nature of perfection, the value of suffering, and the meaning of futility. Rather than being discouraged by the entity's arguments, they incorporated useful insights while rejecting conclusions that didn't serve their development. They treated even hostile philosophy as another learning opportunity. Dr. James Morrison, one of the human philosophers who engaged directly with entity representatives during negotiation attempts, later wrote, "They couldn't understand that we weren't pursuing perfection as a destination. We were pursuing growth as a way of being." You can't discourage someone from growing by pointing out that perfect growth is impossible. That's like trying to discourage someone from walking by, pointing out that they'll never reach the end of infinity. The entity's final approach was direct force, attempting to destroy humanity entirely rather than assimilate them. This strategy had worked as a last resort against species that couldn't be corrupted or convinced, eliminating them as potential threats to collective expansion. The entity marshaled vast resources for the extermination effort, expecting human civilization to collapse under pressure that no biological species could withstand. Instead, the assault triggered the emergence of capabilities that no one, including humans themselves, had realized they possessed. Under extreme pressure, human civilization didn't collapse, it evolved. Individual humans began displaying abilities that exceeded documented limits of biological potential. Human technology advanced at rates that violated established principles of research and development. Human society reorganized itself into configurations that provided capabilities beyond what their numbers should have allowed. Most significantly, humans began voluntarily joining the assault against their own civilization, not through corruption or coercion, but as a conscious choice to accelerate development through maximum challenge. They reasoned that fighting both the entity and corrupted versions of themselves would provide the ultimate test of their adaptive capabilities. The entity found itself facing an opponent that became stronger under pressure, more capable when challenged, and more unified when attacked. Every strategy that had worked against other species made humans more formidable. Every assault that should have weakened them instead forced evolutionary breakthroughs that enhanced their effectiveness. The turning point came when the entity realized that humans weren't simply resisting assimilation. They were attempting to assimilate the entity itself. They were studying its capabilities, understanding its psychology, and developing methods to incorporate its strengths while maintaining their own identity. They weren't trying to defeat the collective consciousness, they were trying to learn from it. This realization forced the entity to confront a possibility it had never encountered, that it might not represent the pinnacle of evolutionary development. The humans had demonstrated capabilities that the collective had never developed, the ability to grow stronger through adversity, to maintain individual identity within group coordination, and to consciously direct their own development rather than simply accumulating external capabilities. Ambassador Chen, now representing humanity in the post-crisis negotiations, addressed the assembled Galactic Council. "We understand why our behavior seemed incomprehensible. You were observing us through the lens of traditional competition, who gets the best position, who demonstrates superiority, who accumulates the most power. We stopped playing that game long ago. We learned that the strongest position is often the one that looks weakest. The most effective strategy is often the one that appears suboptimal. And the greatest power comes from having no need to display power." The final resolution of the Great Convergence Crisis established humanity as not just another galactic civilization, but as teachers of evolutionary methodology that could benefit every species. The beings who had always sat in the back were invited to help design new forms of civilization that could resist assimilation while continuing to develop and grow. The entity itself, recognizing the superiority of human developmental approaches, requested instruction in their methodologies rather than continuing its assimilation campaigns. It had discovered that incorporating other civilizations made it larger but not stronger, while the human approach of conscious self-development could make it both more capable and more resilient. Dr. Zekthara, in her final analysis, concluded, "We have witnessed the emergence of a new form of consciousness that transcends traditional categories. Humans have demonstrated that the ultimate strength lies not in being undefeatable, but in becoming stronger through every defeat. They have shown us that true power comes not from eliminating challenges, but from developing the capacity to transform every challenge into an opportunity for growth." The galactic community's understanding of human repositioning behavior had evolved from dismissive puzzlement to respectful recognition. The species that chose seats in the back weren't avoiding responsibility or hiding from challenges. They were positioning themselves optimally for observation, learning, and response. They had discovered that the best view of any situation often comes from positions that others overlook, and the most effective interventions often emerge from perspectives that seem peripheral. As the crisis concluded and galactic civilization began incorporating human methodologies into their own development processes, the seating arrangements at Galactic Council sessions began to change. Representatives from multiple species started choosing rear positions, recognizing the strategic advantages that humans had understood intuitively. The back rows, once seen as inferior positions, became areas of intense competition as species sought to learn the observational skills that humans had mastered. But humans, true to their nature, began gravitating toward even less prominent positions: service roles, support functions, advisory positions that allowed them to contribute without competing for recognition. They had transcended the need for acknowledgement of their capabilities and moved on to the next phase of their development, learning how to help other species achieve similar evolutionary breakthroughs. The man who destroys his weak self, as human philosophy had always maintained, truly cannot be destroyed by others, because he has already eliminated everything within himself that destruction could target. The humans had proven this principle not just individually, but as a civilization. They had become unassailable not through strength, but through the conscious elimination of whatever weaknesses their enemies might exploit. In sitting at the back, they had claimed the ultimate position, the one that allowed them to see everything, respond to anything, and remain unnoticed until response was required. They had learned that true power lies not in commanding attention, but in commanding understanding, not in dominating others, but in mastering themselves, not in being the strongest, but in becoming stronger than whatever challenges existence might present. The galaxy had finally understood why humans always sat at the back. It wasn't submission. It was mastery of a form so advanced that it looked like its opposite to those who hadn't yet learned to see beyond surface appearances. The species that seemed weakest had proven themselves to be the strongest, not despite their positioning choices, but because of them. Conclusion. This comprehensive analysis concludes that human behavioral patterns, particularly their preference for rear positioning in various contexts, represent the most sophisticated survival and development strategy documented in galactic history. Rather than indicating weakness or submission, these behaviors demonstrate mastery of principles that render traditional concepts of strength and dominance obsolete. The human philosophy of conscious self-improvement through the elimination of internal limitations has proven superior to all external improvement strategies attempted by other civilizations. Their approach to identity as something to be consciously modified rather than defended has created unprecedented adaptability and resilience. Their treatment of challenges as development opportunities rather than threats to be avoided has produced capabilities that exceed what should be biologically possible. Most significantly, humans have demonstrated that the ultimate form of strength is the elimination of whatever within oneself requires external validation, protection, or support. By achieving true independence from the need for prominent positioning, they have gained the freedom to choose positions based purely on strategic effectiveness rather than psychological necessity. The implications for galactic civilization are profound. Every species now has access to methodologies for transcending their current limitations and achieving new forms of consciousness that were previously thought impossible. The Great Convergence Crisis has ended not with the victory of one approach over another, but with the recognition that conscious evolution represents a new phase of galactic development that all species can pursue. Humans continue to sit in the back, but now they do so as teachers rather than students, guides rather than followers, and examples of what every species might become if they learn to destroy their own weaknesses before others have the opportunity to exploit them. The galaxy's toughest species had been hiding in plain sight, demonstrating their superiority through the very behaviors that others had misinterpreted as inferiority. The man who destroys his weak self cannot be destroyed by others, and a species that masters this principle collectively becomes not just undefeatable, but a catalyst for the evolution of consciousness itself throughout the galaxy. End of document classification. Approved for general distribution. Educational use authorized archive location. GCA Prime Historical Analysis. Human Studies Distribution. All member species, leadership and educational institutions.